Our brains predicted, as it were, that all these edges must have a center, a something, a thing. So all our knowledge comes from a comparison of edges. It's relative, it's temporal, and totally a comparison between two or more edges. And we've predicted that there's a center to these edges called a thing, called a franc, called a tree, called a cup, called coffee, called times, called space, and it goes on and on. But we have never known what an apple is, or time, or space, or Frank, or Paul. We have never met a separate something. All we've ever known are comparisons between one edge and another edge. And that's where knowledge comes from. It's a little bit like electricity knowledge is. Electricity isn't in the positive pole or the negative pole or in the space between the poles. It's only when you put all those edges together, as it were, does electricity appear. So knowledge appears in the relative relationship between edges, which is how the five senses developed. And to create a simplified map, as it were, because we had to move quickly, so maps had to be quite simple. So we simplify our maps by negating most information, because we can't process the immense complexity of all the information, of all the data that's being presented. So our five senses already simplify and simplify and simplify down to the edges that really it deemed had utility. And those edges that had utility, we predicted, we made them into things, as it were, by predicting that there must be a center to these edges. That this comparison, which I call a tree, there must be a separate center to this thing called tree. And then as the brain sophisticated, it developed this rocket fuel, in a way, that increased its ability to move. It increased its dynamic range hugely, because it was able to create a subjective edge appearing to be separate from an objective edge. So instead of there just being like a primitive animalistic immediate response to stimuli, it enabled itself to, as it were, stand back from its experience, from its map, and overlay other possibilities, when it was able to create that, in a way, another protective edge, which we call the subject, the me. And when I was able to stand back from that animalistic map, suddenly our ability to make choices, or our range of movement, increased, just exponentially. And so humans, as we know them, became top of the pyramid, as it were. And then those edges, which we made into things, which are it's all a physiological, a brain process, then develops into what we call a cultural process, really. The things then become simplified into the things that had most utility, were given more meaning, like a hierarchy. And those things that had more meaning become beliefs. And this then becomes a shared cultural dynamic, really, a cultural knowledge. And those beliefs, in a way that which were solidified or even more, became our truths. The map or the model we use to function or to move in life. And then you have that slight little problem of a truth coming back into contact with life again. It's like the rubber hitting the road again, where there's always a friction. There has to be a friction, because it's always, in a sense, receiving new information. And that new information has to be fitted into the existing model, as it were, or rejected. But there's always a constant friction. There's always a constant, in a sense, imbalance in the system. So the system is very much interested in new edges, because new edges could be, in a very primitive way, could be food, or could be, or I could be the food. The new edges are the most interesting aspect of information coming in. So our brains and our senses tend to give new edges a lot more. In a way, they magnify them, but by negation. They negate what they think they know, the system knows, by making it slightly boring in a way. Well, I know that's a cup and saucer. So it becomes, it draws less attention from the systems, but the new edges draw a lot more attention. So the brain using attention in a way, it's a bit like a camera. Wherever the focal length of a camera is, things come into focus. So the system, wherever it puts its attention, that, in a sense, is magnified into focus, into knowledge. We, in a sense, the relative relationship between two edges, one of which is your body and one, say, the environment, in a sense, brings into name and form, into time and space, an essence which is immeasurable, which has no edges, because it's not a something. We can only make measurements of edges. We can only know if there's a gap, in a way, between a this and a that, a subject and an object, a male and a female, a past and a future, a sweet and a sour, loud and silence. We can only, all our knowledge comes out of these comparisons of these edges. But the brain, this is like eating the apple in the Garden of Eden, the apple of knowledge. The trade-off of this huge utility, this knowledge, was the prediction that there must be a center, a separate center to these edges, that the object must have a separate center, whatever that may be. And this subject, which is just another object, as it were, also has a center called a me. But an objective center, or indeed a subjective center, has never been experienced, has never been found, has never been known. Because this thing we can't talk about, we can just have this sort of drunken conversation about it, has no gap. There is no relationship between two things. So it cannot be talked about. So in that sense, anything that can be written in a book or talked about cannot describe the immeasurableness of this ocean, of what is. I often call words a bit like a spade. They're brilliant for digging holes into the ground and building foundations and building any sort of structure you want on those foundations. But when we come to the ocean, the spade is not very effective to dig in holes. To try to get to the bottom of it is an impossibility and also very exhausting.
Yeah, no, but
using an inappropriate tool.
Still, though, I felt drunk there listening to you. Like it's the way you describe, it's like a drunken conversation for a moment. I did feel flowing, but the and that's a description of this formation and solidity of a self, that it's
how the formless appears to be a form, and they're not two. We have to be very careful with words because we are having a drunken conversation. But in a way, all these words will be vomited out. Anything said will be vomited out. Any measurement will be vomited out.
What do you mean by that when you say that?
As
Vomited
not
out?
needed, as inappropriate.
Just Ramosh, just blah, blah, blah.
But the paradox is that whatever measurement or whatever appears is what we're talking about. The only error, if you could say that, is the illusion that this knowledge has created, that there must be a center to the measurements we give to sight, sound, hearing, touch, taste, thoughts, feelings, that all these measurements of these edges have a center. There are no things, Frank. There are no centers.